What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Human Predator Packmule podcast. It's been a while since we've done an episode. I'm actually going to do this one by myself, flying solo, and I'm going to start a series, a Q&A series of I asked some questions on Instagram, like what do you guys want to hear me explain on the podcast? And so I got a few lined up where we're going to start answering questions for you guys, and I'm going to keep asking questions of you on Instagram. So if you don't follow us on Instagram, it's at Human Predator Packmule. So I'm going to keep asking on the Instagram story, what do you guys want to learn? What do you want to hear about? What do you want explained? And we're going to keep this Q&A series going with some other podcasts interspersed. But today we are starting with a question that I got about when to change up your typical workout or typical training program. And man, I thought about this. I wrote some stuff down, and it's not. There's nuance, right? So it's more than just saying, well, X. If you see X, then Y. There are different things to consider, and we're going to talk through all of them today. The first thing we're going to talk through are typical time frames. Like, what are typical training time frames for different things that you want to achieve? We're going to talk about your training consistency. Is there a goal change? Your performance and recovery monitoring and different life factors that might influence you to change your training. And so we're going to walk through all of that today. And I think you're not going to see what's coming with the lifestyle factor stuff. So you're going to hang around for the end for that one. But let's jump in with the typical time frame. So if you look at what we do and what most smart strength and conditioning coaches do with their training, you're going to look at a training phase, which is going to be somewhere between 3 to 6 weeks. And then you have a training block, which is a collection of training phases, all working towards the same goal, which is going to be somewhere in the 8 to 12 week mark, depending on what exactly you're working on and the person that you're working with. So the thing that you need to consider is what kind of stress you need to apply to create the outcome that you want to create, and how long do those things typically take, right? And so if you look at something like strength development and aerobic development, you typically need 8 to 12 weeks to get the adaptations that you're looking for. And that is one of the reasons that we focus so much on relative strength training and strength endurance, and we also focus on aerobic training so much, because these adaptations take the longest to elicit, but they also last the longest. So you can let's say that you take a month off of training, you're going to have more of your strength and aerobic adaptations than you will like your high-end lactic or anaerobic adaptations, because they're structural. They actually change the structure of your muscle fibers, your nervous system, whereas lactic and higher intensity adaptations are more metabolic, so they're more enzymatically based, and so they go away a lot faster. So that's one of the reasons that we focus on this. So you're going to look at typical time frames. So every 3 to 6 weeks, you're going to see a change in a training phase. Every 8 to 12 weeks, you're going to see in the training blocks. Those training phases should stack together to achieve the same end as far as the training goal goes. I say 3 to 6 weeks. Typically, ours are about a month, right? So you're going to see a training phase that lasts about a month. I think all of our training phases are a month. I program them for a month, and we waive the intensity and the volume throughout that month. The truth, a lot of people adapt to training at different rates. So very good athletes, people that are very even well-trained, they tend to adapt to training faster. So we're someone that isn't as athletic, doesn't have the same genetics, might take a little bit longer. So what some people do in 3 weeks, it might take other people 6 weeks. And so if you split the difference and look at 4 weeks, you can really get a good general sweet spot for people when it comes to a training program. So we look at 4-week training blocks, or 4-week training phases that go into training blocks. And so each training phase that comes after the next will build on that training phase to accomplish the goal of the training block. So if you're looking at like when to change your program, for most people it's going to be about once a month. Now, the thing about that is like, it depends, and let's talk about that consistency, right? So if you're consistently training, you're consistently doing your program, the things that go into your program, then that 4 to 6 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks block is going to be good, or training phase is going to be good for you. If you're not consistent, so if you're missing training, that time frame extends, right? And so you have to figure out, first of all, how are you going to get more consistent with your training? And the second of all is like you just have to stretch it out a little bit longer. It's going to take longer to get all of the inputs that you need to make the change that you want. So if you're looking at like, when should I change my training program, the first thing you got to look at is how consistent are you. So if you're nailing your consistency, you're training, strength training 2 to 4 days per week, you're conditioning 2 to 4 days per week, somewhere in there, and you're nailing that, it's probably going to be about every month you need to make a change. But if not, you're probably going to have to stretch it out a little bit longer. You also have to consider the intensity of what you're doing. So if you're doing some really intense training, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, so maybe really, really heavy strength training, or really you have some intense conditioning days, you're not going to do those for quite as long. Sometimes we only do, I say the training phase is a month long, but so maybe we only do that intense aspect of that training phase for the first 3 weeks, because if we continue to introduce that amount of stress, that intensity, we're going to end up having diminishing returns. We're going to end up overtraining. We're going to end up with an injury, something like that. So more intensity, the faster the change. So we're looking more towards the 3 week end of the spectrum. Lower intensity likely needs more volume and longer duration to make the change. So you're not going to make those changes as fast. You might just add more of that same kind of stress. Okay. So the next thing that we need to consider is a goal change. Is your goal changed? Then you obviously need to change your training. So I'll give you an example from something that we do. We look at overall strength and we look at specific strength. Okay, so early in the year, we focus more, as far as our strength training goes, we deadlift a lot more often, because deadlift is the best strength builder, the best overall strength builder, because it recruits the most muscle mass, okay? That ends up helping you coordinate your nervous system better and gives you nervous system output. It also uses your grip, which has a bigger nervous system component. So recruiting more muscle mass, synchronizing the nervous system better, using your grip, more strength output, more strength potential. So we deadlift earlier in the year to make sure that we're getting our relative strength to the point that we need. The thing is, deadlift does not help you as much uphill as squatting does, right? So as we move into the preseason and during the season, we squat more. So the goal changed. So if you look at the early part of the year, our goal is to build our relative strength and our overall, our general strength endurance as high as possible. The deadlift is going to solve that problem for us the best. But as you move into the summer, you move into the fall, squatting and preparing for uphill climbing, squatting is going to help us prepare for uphill climbing far better than deadlifting is. So deadlifting still exists, just not as, in our programs, just not as much. And we move squat to the forefront, and squatting variations. So things like rear foot elevated split squats, all of the single leg work that would be what some people would call knee or quad dominant, gets moved to the forefront of the training. So if you look at the goal change and throughout the training phases, throughout the training blocks, and even your specific training, that's when you're going to make a change, right? So even, for example, if you want to put on muscle, you're probably not going to fill a bunch of your training with deadlifting, because you can only handle so much deadlift volume. You can handle far more, most people can handle far more squat volume than they can deadlift volume, or even single joint volume. If you go through a phase where you want to build strength and get ready to use more intensity so that you can build muscle, you would deadlift. Then it gets into the hypertrophy phase. You're probably going to cut back on the deadlifting and do other things so you can handle more training volume, so that you can build more muscle, because the volume is going to be the biggest driver of that stress that allows you to build muscle. So think about it as goals change. You know, for most people, I think what we see is like, they don't finish a training phase or a training block before they make a change. You got to get through and get through the training phase, the training block, achieve the goal, and then move on. But as the goal changes, you have to make sure that you change the inputs that you're going to give to it. Otherwise, you're not going to reach your goal. Okay? Another thing that we need to look at when it comes to when to make a change with your training, whether it's programming or exercises, whether it's a training phase or workout, whatever it might be, is stagnation. So have you stopped getting better? So one of the things that we have to consider is you should see an upward trajectory for the most part. You should see yourself getting better from week to week for the most part. Now, The caveat to that is sometimes when we introduce a lot of stress, we got to get better before we get worse before we get better. So sometimes you're going to get into a training hole. So for example, let's say, you go through the first 3 weeks of a program, it's a lot of training stress, you might see your performance decline. But if we remove a little bit of that stress and your performance doesn't come back up, then you're starting to stagnate, right? And so if you don't see yourself getting better, it's probably time for a change. When we really see this is when people start doing the same thing for month in and month out. I'm talking about like the exact same thing, the exact same rep schemes, the exact same exercises, the exact same type of conditioning for the exact same duration. That's when people really start to stagnate. What we want to see, especially for something like endurance training, so let's talk about low intensity aerobic training, what's going to get us that adaptation is more accrued training volume. So we want to look at like a 5 to 10% increase every week until we get as we get through the developmental phase, and then we can maintain it, right? But a lot of people, first of all, don't walk their volume up in the appropriate way, or they don't stick with it long enough to get the things that they need out of it. The same thing with strength. They get bored and they make a change too fast, whereas they needed to get through that month, maybe the second month, maybe the third month to get to where they really needed to be, but they make a change too fast. And you don't even get to that point to really be able to determine if there's any level of stagnation, right? So, but if you start to see if you've been sticking with the same thing for a long time and you see stagnation, it's time to make the change. Really what we want to see every 3 to 6 weeks, there needs to be some kind of exercise change, but different selection, or there needs to be a different loading change, different set and rep schemes, different time under tension, different things like that. Because that's when we start to adapt. We need to change the stressor, increase the stressor to get more out of it, okay? And the thing is, let's go back to the goal change. That's one of the things that you have to look at is as you get closer to the season, we want to make things more specific. So right now, we're coming, it's November, we're about to come out of hunting season. We're going to go back to more of a general training type of phase. That general training is going to last in certain degree up until we get close to the summer. Now, we'll still do specific things that we'll always need to do, which will be rucking, which will be hiking, things like that to maintain our conditioning. But for the most part, our gym workouts will get far more general. Then as we get closer to the season, we'll get more specific. So we're looking at a change, and we'll see changes in volume and intensity from week to week. So volume would be the amount of work you do. Intensity would be, in the weight room, would be how much weight you're using. And then in the conditioning would be the amount of effort that you expend would be the intensity. So we're going to see first 3 months of the year very general, a little more specific the next 3 months, and then those 3 months the summer leading up to the season is going to be very specific, and we'll maintain that specificity as we move into hunting season. And so those are on a general grand scale, that's how you're going to want to see the time changes. But as you're looking at week to week, you're going to see some, typically from week to week, some kind of volume intensity change depending on the training goal and the exercises and the methods that we're using. Then from month to month, you'll see a change. And then from training block, which would be 3 months, 2 to 3 months, to the next training block, you'll see a change. But that's all goal-based, right? So I took a step back there. Now we look at the stagnation piece. If you've been doing the same thing for months and months and months and you're not getting better, it's time for a change. Or if you've been doing the same thing, for 2 months and you haven't made any kind of change. There used to be this concept that you used to hear about from the P90X that there's this muscle confusion and all that kind of shit. It's not a real thing. Your body wants to adapt. It needs a stimulus to adapt to. And so you have to realize that once you adapt, you either are going to maintain that adaptation and keep it, and sometimes that's fine. So one of the things we'll do is we'll build our aerobic capacity, and then we'll do just enough volume to maintain it while we do something else. Or you need to change and develop something else. And so you can only string so many developmental training blocks together before you overtrain. So one of the things that we look at is we do a big developmental push first as part of the year, back off a little bit, preseason gets more developmental, and then we maintain those abilities with our specific training in season. So another thing to consider is how that all phases and blocks out throughout the training year. So another thing that we have to consider is the type of training that we're doing. So like we talked about, tempo training is tempo lifting is a type of lifting where you keep the muscles under tension for quite a while giving them limited rest. So, for example, you have to keep constant tension on the muscle during a squat. So you would lower for 2 seconds, no pause at the bottom, up for 2 seconds, no pause at the top, and you'll do somewhere between 40 to 60 seconds of work like that, then get incomplete rest. So you only rest for 30 to 60 seconds. What this does is deprives the muscles of oxygen, and it causes your slow twitch muscles to actually get bigger. Once they get bigger, we can put more endurance stuff inside there. So more mitochondria, more of the enzymes, aerobic enzymes that we need. The bigger we have those muscle fibers, the more we can get out of them for our endurance. And so, but the thing is like you can only really handle that kind of training with the degree that you need to do it for about 3 weeks at a time. Same thing with VO2 max training. So you need like 3 to 6 exposures to really start to push yourself, to push the adaptations that you want. So VO2 max training, we're talking, you're doing 3 to 5 minute intervals at just about as hard as you can push, resting for 3 to 5 minutes, and then going again. And so the way that I phase that out and what seems to work best is 3 weeks on and then a break. And then if we need to do more to develop that person, then we'll do another 3 weeks. But training and loading types will dictate how frequently you'll need to make a change. So for example, aerobic capacity training, it might be that we walk up the time, but the actual mode of training isn't going to change that quickly because like we said, we need 8 to 12 weeks to get what we need, sometimes longer depending on the person. So we won't make a change quite as fast. Also, remember the comments that we had about low intensity doesn't need to make a change as fast as high intensity needs to make a change. So another thing to keep in mind, if you're using a more high intense method, whether that's intense strength training, whether that's intense conditioning, you're going to want to make a change faster, more towards the 3-week end of the spectrum instead of the 6-week end of the spectrum, right? So understanding that the more intensity, the faster you're going to need to change because you're going to need a break, okay? So that's really something to focus on when you're loading type. So more intense, so heavier weight, more effort in your conditioning, faster change, lower intensity, slower change, keep that same kind of training for a little bit longer. Now, another thing that we need to consider is actually, I want to take a step back with training and loading types. One of the things that we will do in our training is change the way that we load an exercise instead of changing the exercise itself. Now, why? This is especially true of strength training because if you're constantly changing the exercise, then you have to learn how to do that exercise and then apply intensity with that exercise. So we keep the same basic menu of strength exercises mostly throughout most part of the year. Now, we get into specific strength exercises, I say specific, but more, how do I want to say this? Closer to what the joint angles your body would be at when you're hunting, whether that's going uphill, something like that. We move more towards that as the year progresses and we get more towards hunting season. But we keep the same essential menu of strength exercises year round because once you learn an exercise and you get good at it, it's easier to apply intensity, use more weight, whatever it might be, with that exercise, rather than having to constantly learn new things all the time. Because then if you're learning, you can't train as hard, right? And we want to be able to train hard. So we keep a simple menu of strength exercises so that we can train hard year round. We just change the loading type. So it might be like a straight set deal where we're doing 3 sets of 5. It might be a eustress training type thing. It might be a high intensity continuous training thing, but we use similar or the same exercises so that we can apply the appropriate amount of intensity into those exercises to get what we need to get out of them, okay? So, other thing that we need to consider that a lot of people miss on is lifestyle factors. So, if you have a lot of stress elsewhere in your life, you're likely not going to be able to train as hard. And that's totally fine. Dan John, someone that I've looked up to for a long time and was a mentor of mine, says, he wants you to look at a calendar year round. And you can look, and most of the time, denote when you're going to have high stress, when you're going to have lower stress. And then you know what buttons you can press and how intense you can make your training at different times of the year. For example, if you're a tax accountant, March and April probably aren't the times of year when you want to train your hardest, because you're going to be under so much life and work stress in other parts of your life. If you just had a baby, and whether you're a man or a woman, like if you're the father supporting the woman, or if you're the woman that just had the baby, both of you are going to be stressed in a new way and are going to have your energy zapped. Mostly you won't be sleeping as much. You have this focus on keeping a new human alive. You should know in that time frame that you're just not going to train as hard. So what you have to do is take a step back and look at your training and looking at the rest of your life and say, where can I apply intensity? Where do I need to pull back? And understanding as these things toggle, like, the intensity of life pulls back. Okay, maybe we can put more intensity into our training, or the intensity in life toggles up. We need to pull back our training. Your brain, your body just sees it all as stress, as one big mishmash of stress. So you can't think like, oh, well, training stress is different than this other life stress, because your body just accounts for all of it as stress. And if you take your stress load too high, beyond the reach of what your body can handle, you're going to tank yourself. Your training's going to stagnate. Mentally, you're going to stagnate. You're going to perform poor in other parts of your life. So you need to make sure that you account for all of that and make a change based on that. So if you're in the middle of a program that's very intense and you've had a life change, then it would be in your best interest to tone back the training until you get through that phase of life, that you can apply intensity again, okay? Or that's typically the smartest thing that you can do to make sure that you're going to get the most out of things long term and not beat yourself up, keep your head on straight, and also get the most out of your training. Because the biggest thing, the most important training variable is consistency. You have to be able to train up consistently to get what you want over the long term. And so whatever strategy you need to apply in that situation to make sure that you get, you can train consistently and continue to show up is going to be the biggest thing. Because there are going to be seasons of life when you just have to show up and check the box. I just went through one myself. I just moved from Virginia to California, and over the handful of the past few months, like, there's been a lot going on. There's the stress of driving back and forth across the country. I literally did it 3 times. I drove to California, drove back to Virginia to get the rest of my stuff, and then I drove to California again. And so I had to account for that stress. I had to account for the stress and the life changes and settling into the new routine and being in a new place. All of that, whether you're totally conscious of it or not, stresses you out. And you can't apply training stress in the same way. And having that understanding will save you a lot of frustration, but will also help your longevity. But what I did do is I was consistent with what I could do. Even if the strength training didn't look exactly how it was supposed to on paper, I did it. Even if conditioning didn't look exactly how it was supposed to on paper, I did it. I maintained my consistency, even if it wasn't perfect. And that's something that we have to look at in those stressful times, and not have an all or nothing mindset and say, oh, well, if I can't do it as perfectly as I want to do it, then I'm just not going to do it at all, because then our consistency tanks, and we end up getting into bad patterns where, one of the things that we always talk about at my gym is, like, people say, well, when life slows down, it's never going to slow down. Like, you're always going to have, figuring out how to do things when you're busy is going to be important for your long-term success. That being said, there are different levels of stress at different times in the year and different seasons of life. And so maintaining your consistency by checking the box when all you really have the smoke for is to check the box is important, but then understanding when you can really drop smoke or when you need to drop smoke, and also maybe manage some of the other stresses in your life. Because let's say that you have a big sheep hunt coming up. You're going to have to train hard for that. And so you have to take a step back and look at the rest of your life and say, where do I need to toggle things back? What's important? What isn't important? What can I not get rid of? Where can I eliminate all of these things that might be stealing my bandwidth, so I can train appropriately hard to do the things that I want to do and need to do? Okay, so that's just a way to approach it. But when you're making these changes, when you're thinking about changing your program, the thing is to remember, let's do a recap. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing a recap. Time frame, 3 to 6 weeks on a training phase, 8 to 12 weeks on a training block. Remember that your consistency dictates how long you might do something. Has the goal changed? Are you trying to build strength, or are you trying to gain muscle? Are you doing general preparation, or are you trying to do specific preparation? Those are all things that are going to dictate a change. Are you monitoring your performance and your recovery? If your performance super tanks, you know it's probably time to make a change. If you've come out of like a phase where you're supposed to have a lot of stress. But if you see continued significant declines, it might be time to rest. It also might be time to make a change, okay? Training and loading types. The more intense the loading type, the faster the change. So super duper heavy lifting, faster change. Super duper intense conditioning, faster change. Less intense, you can maintain it for longer. Okay? And remember, always consider your lifestyle factors. What do you need to toggle on? What do you need to toggle off based on the stress in your life? Are there things that you need to mitigate so you can maintain your bandwidth in the way that you want to train? Okay? So this was a great question. Thanks so much. A guy named Aaron sent it in. So thank you, Aaron, for sending in this question. Next week, I'm going to talk about power training for hunters and why it's important. And we're also going to talk about transitioning from in-season training into out-of-season training and other things that you might want to do, like build strength or run an ultra marathon or something like that. So that's coming up next week. So make sure you tune in for that. And in the meantime, you want more tips? Here's what I want you to do. Click on our show notes. Download the 5 biggest backcountry mistakes and how to avoid them. That book is full of incredible wisdom, from rucking to strength training to your conditioning to handling your mental fitness as you prep for a backcountry hunt, or just honestly in life. And then once you download that actually also puts you on our newsletter list. I email 5 times per week with tips, with stories, with all kinds of stuff about hunting that's going to help you. Well, it's going to be entertaining, but it's also going to help you with your fitness and with your hunting. So click that and download that. And in the meantime, read it, and I'll talk to you next week. You'll also be seeing, if you're following me on Instagram, if you're not following me on Instagram, go do that, at Human Predator Packmule. And I will be asking for more questions for our Q&A episode. So thanks for tuning in. It's great to be back, and I'll talk to you guys next week.